Dr. David Berry is the senior toxicologist in Region 8 at EPA. I don't want to embarrass him, but I do believe that he's probably one of the leading experts in the world in fibrous minerals and their toxic effects. I do not believe that we can have anybody better here tonight to talk to us than Dr. David Berry.
With that introduction, I think I should sit down. As Doug said, my name is David Berry. I'm a toxicologist in Region 8 in Denver, and I have, I guess, maybe the honor and the distinction of. Can't hear me? Okay. I will try to project myself a little more. I work on the Libby Asbestos Superfund site in Libby, Montana. I've been working on that site since 2009. Prior to my coming to Region 8 in Denver, I was with Cal EPA in Sacramento, California. I worked on the Clear Creek management area, which is an area of naturally occurring asbestos. I also lived in the community of El Dorado Hills, which had naturally occurring asbestos. So I've been around the asbestos field for a number of years. And what I would like to do tonight is talk to you about the toxicity of Libby amphibole and amphibole asbestos in general. And EPA in December of 2014 published a large document entitled Libby Amphibole Asbestos Toxicity Assessment. And this was a document EPA had worked on for a number of years. I'm one of the co-authors on that document, and it describes in details the toxicity of amphibole asbestos in laboratory animals and in humans. And so I'm going to go through some of the studies that we used to derive these toxicity factors for Libby amphibole asbestos. And these toxicity factors are not regulatory values. They are values that are to be used in assessing risk. They are not benchmark values for determining whether or not a certain level is hazardous or not. They are used in risk assessment, not in regulatory arena. So the next slide kind of goes through some of the diseases that we know are caused by asbestos. Everyone knows that mesothelioma is a disease that is associated with asbestos exposure. All you have to do is look at television and see all the ads from lawyers. I call them ambulance chasers, who are espousing the recovery of damages due to asbestos exposure. So clearly mesothelioma and lung cancer are associated with asbestos exposure. What has come out of the investigations of the human populations in Libby, Montana, in a population in Marysville, Ohio, a population in and around Minneapolis, and a population in Pilnew, Australia, is that there are a number of other diseases that are associated with asbestos exposure. These diseases are non-cancer diseases. They include localized pleural thickening. The pleura is a tissue lining around the lung, and this is also the tissue that is a mesenchymal tissue that is the site of mesothelioma. But localized pleural thickening is not a cancerous affliction. It is a basic collagen deposit on the lining of the lung. And if you get enough of those deposits on the lung, you lose pulmonary function. So you cease to be able to breathe. Diffuse pleural thickening is a kind of increased severity of localized pleural thickening, and it covers more of the lung. Small interstitial opacities are growths that are inside the lung. These are believed to be precursors to asbestosis. Asbestosis is another disease that basically causes fibrosis in the lung, and that results in the lung being unable to expand and contract and exchange oxygen. And finally, we now know that there are a number of systemic autoimmune diseases that are associated with asbestos exposure, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. Next slide. This slide just kind of shows you a little bit about lung anatomy, and that as you move down the respiratory system from the trachea into the alveoli of the lung, that you get more and more places for fibers to essentially be deposited. So when you get down here into the alveolar sacs, there's about 8 million or so in an adult places where fibers can actually reside. The next slide. This just shows you that there are differences in how the lung responds to fibers of different sizes. Large particles that are in the range of 10 microns or greater are not absorbed into the lung very well. They're usually eliminated through the nose or throat and never make it to the lung. Particles that are smaller, down to 5 microns, can get into the respiratory system, but do not get into the lower regions of the lung. Fibers that are 5 microns or 0.5 microns or less can get into the alveoli, and these fibers are the fibers that are approximately the size of respirable fibers from asbestos. The size of the asbestos fibers that we look at that are respirable, these fibers have a dimension of about 0.25 microns in diameter. They are 5 microns or greater in length, and they have an aspect ratio, which is the ratio of length to width, of 3 to 1 or greater. And these are the fibers that are the toxic fibers that enter into the lung. The next slide just shows you comparatively what these fibers look like. The large fiber right here is a human hair, and the small little fibers that are behind those are amphibole fibers from a compound called amacet, and that's an electron micrograph, just to kind of put the fiber size in perspective. Next slide. Rod mentioned some of this, but it's worth repeating. Once an asbestos fiber is inhaled into the lung, it resides in the lung. These fibers are very biodurable. We could take amphibole asbestos fibers and put them in a petri dish and pour hydrochloric acid on them, and they would not dissolve. They'd just sit there. And that's the case in the lung. Once the fibers are inhaled into the lung, they remain there. Their half-life is greater than 20 years, and all the time that they're residing in the lung, they are eliciting some form of biological response. So fiber dose can be cumulative because these fibers do reside and stay in the lung. as Rod said, the disease takes a long time to develop. The disease is kind of dependent on the dose, so that the higher the dose, the earlier the onset of disease. But it usually takes 10 to 40 years for the disease to manifest itself. Asbestos-related diseases, such as pleural thickening, autoimmune disorders, and asbestosis, have a tendency to occur earlier than mesothelioma. The next slide. This provides you kind of a roadmap of what data the EPA used to derive its toxicity factors for amphibole asbestos. We examined the human epidemiological data from the Libby minor cohort and the Troy and Libby communities. And you're asking, what is a cohort? A cohort is a population of people that are used in an epidemiological study to study some level of exposure. So these are population of individuals in Libby who either worked at the mine or individuals who lived in the community. We also looked at a detailed study of the O.M. Scott facility in Marysville, Ohio. I'm sure all of you, well, maybe not, because I'm not sure that many of you have green lawns here in Boulder City. But for those of you who do have lawns, you've probably used Scott's lawn care products for controlling weeds and insects in your lawn. The Scott facility used vermiculite from the Libby mine in Montana to carry agricultural chemicals for distribution to homeowners in Scott's lawn care products. And these individuals at the O.M. Scott facility were exposed to low levels of asbestos because the vermiculite that came from the Libby mine was contaminated with amphibole asbestos. So that was another cohort that we used to investigate and allow us to look at exposure response responses in these individuals. We also looked at another site, a Western Mineral site in Minneapolis. This was a facility that received ore from Libby, Montana. The ore was heated, exfoliated, and generated vermiculite, which was then sold as zonalite insulation. And the zonalite vermiculite contained upwards of 20% amphibole asbestos in it. Over the years, the company who manufactured this tried to decrease the level of asbestos by screening out some of the ore that was more heavily contaminated. But zonalite vermiculite is a fairly common home insulation and is in perhaps well over 1 million homes in the United States is attic insulation. The last population that we looked at was a population of miners and their families associated with a grapsitolite mine in Western Australia called Pilnew. So those were the studies that we used to help us evaluate the toxicity of amphibole asbestos. And all this is detailed in the document with the website down there at the bottom of the slide. The next slide. This is Libby, Montana. It's a beautiful little town in northwestern Montana, and it was the site of the W.R. Grace vermiculite operation called Vermiculite Mountain. Next slide. This is some details on the Libby Minor cohort. We looked at data from individuals that were exposed to dust and materials associated with the mine from 1959 to 2007. There were about 880 participants in this particular cohort. There were 7 deaths from mesothelioma, 32 deaths from lung cancer. Greater than 50% of the people of the minor cohort had some form of pleural abnormalities. And the abnormalities increased with the cumulative fiber exposure. CFE is cumulative fiber exposure, and the range of exposures that these people have ranged from less than 1 fiber per cc to greater than 1,700 fibers per cc. And for those of you who know anything about OSHA, and there's what they call a permissible exposure level for asbestos, that value is 0.1 fibers per cc. So these miners were exposed to very high concentrations of fibers in the air. The actual mine and the dry mill that were up on the vermiculite mountain put out on the average of about 5,000 pounds of asbestos fibers into the air on a daily basis. And there are approximately 50,000 acres of contaminated forest adjacent to the mine, and we have asbestos fibers entrained in the tree bark and in the forest duff. The vermiculite that was processed and manufactured here was shipped all over the world and used for insulation and a number of other products. And the people in the community could use the vermiculite freely for their own home insulation, for soil amendments, for a number of uses. So there was vermiculite throughout the community when we got to Libby in 1999. Next slide. ATSDR has performed a screening level assessment in Libby that involves about 7,000 participants. In that screening, it was shown that there have been over 400 deaths associated with non-cancer diseases. So 400 deaths is a lot more than the 137 total mesothelioma and lung cancer deaths in the minor cohorts. So it began to look to us that the non-cancer diseases were probably causing more mortality and more morbidity in the community than cancer. A lot of the community had pulmonary fibrosis and asbestosis. 18% of them had some form of pleural abnormalities, and localized pleural thickening, depending on the dose, can manifest itself as early as 8 years, and with calcification of these pleural plaques, that can occur as early as 17 years. The next slide. Based on the ATSDR screening in the Libby community, you can see that loss of pulmonary function occurred in approximately 22% of the individuals that were occupationally exposed, that is the miners. And environmental exposures, 16% of the participants had some form of loss of pulmonary function. We also saw an increase in cardiovascular diseases, and as I said, systemic autoimmune diseases were manifested in the Libby population, and these include rheumatoid arthritis, systemic lupus, and also the presence of autoimmune antibodies. The interesting thing about rheumatoid arthritis is that it's generally a gender-specific disease affecting women more than men. In Libby, the ratio of men to women are almost 1-to-1, which is highly unique. Next slide. This takes us to Marysville, Ohio. This was the site of the O.M. Scott facility. The next slide. As I said, this facility used Libby ore. They expanded it into vermiculite and then sorbed agricultural chemicals onto the product and then sold it as a lawn care product. This was actually the earliest published report of toxicity associated with Libby amphibole. In 1980, there were 10 bloody pleural effusions that were described and investigated by investigators at the University of Cincinnati. They also did some radiographic screening of this population, and they found that approximately 2% of this population had pleural plaques or localized pleural thickening on the pleura. 25-year follow-up of that cohort, 28% of the workers now had a pleural effect, so the response is increasing fairly dramatically. Localized pleural thickening affected 68 of the 430 workers that were examined, and the fiber levels that these people were exposed to were much lower than the fiber levels that the miners were exposed to in Libby. The fiber levels that the folks in Marysville are exposed to range from about 0.013 fibers per cc to around 120 fibers per cc. So the exposure level was much lower. The next slide. Oops. Sorry. Is a further follow-on, which is a 30-year follow-on. By this time, we have some mesotheliomas showing up in the population, 3 mesotheliomas. These were at fiber levels that ranged from 5 to about 48 fibers per cc. In 2015, in another investigation where instead of using X-rays for examining the pleural abnormalities, they use a high-resolution computing tomography, which is a much more sensitive tool to look at pulmonary disorders. And here we have 119 now of the 434 individuals expressing localized pleural thickening. And it was this data set, because of the exposures that were monitored in this population, it was this data set that we used to derive the toxicity factors, the non-cancer toxicity factor for Libby amphibole. The next slide shows you a expansion facility. This is the one in Western Minerals. The next slide just gives you kind of a picture of the number of individuals that were in the worker and residential cohort around this processing facility. We unfortunately don't have actual measurements of individuals' exposures like we did in Marysville, so we only have modeled exposures. So we really couldn't use these data analytically to focus on developing an exposure response model. But we do know that from the modeling that exposures ranged from fairly low levels, 0.05, 0.07 fibers per cc, to upwards of around 1.5, 2 fibers per cc. So again, these are fairly low levels of fiber exposure. The next slide, I think, just details a little bit more. The data, we had 11% of the population that we looked at that had some form of pleural anomalies. We had 5 cases of diffuse pleural thickening, which is about 1%. And we had about 4% of the population around the facility that had some form of parenchymal abnormalities. The next slide shows you the Pilnew Community and the Pilnew mine in Western Australia. This mine mined crucidolite, which is also known as blue asbestos. And they not only used and sold the asbestos, but all the waste rock from the mine was taken into the community and paved roads and were put in the backyards to control dust. And all of the mine waste, of course, contained fairly significant levels of crucidolite. So the next slide kind of details some of the details of the exposure. The mine operated from 1943 to 1966. The mine and town were heavily contaminated with crucidolite. The residential cohort consisted of men and women, and estimated air concentrations in the community was approximately 1 fiber per cc, which is above our OSHA PEL. And when they installed a new mill in the mine area, the air concentration dropped down to about 1/2 fiber per cc. We don't have real good exposure data for the individuals. The Australians did not, at the time that they were doing these investigations, didn't have the technology to really monitor the air concentrations. So we don't have accurate air concentrations on the Pilnew cohort. The next slide shows you some of the statistics. There were, in the residential cohort, there have been 437 deaths due to cancer. 47 of those have been mesotheliomas. The time to onset for tumor development ranged from 20 to about 52 years. And the death rate is fairly high on a per 100,000 person year. Next slide talks a little about the minor cohort. And again, large number of deaths. Time to onset is 10 to 52 years. And that 10 is kind of indicative that these folks were exposed to really high levels in the mine. And the higher the level of exposure, the shorter the latency for development of disease. The death rate was quite high per 100,000. We also saw quite a number of deaths due to asbestos and also to cardiovascular and circular diseases. I think the next slide shows one other interesting fact about the minor cohort. When the researchers in Australia studied the exposure to children to asbestos in the Pilnew community, and they followed the children that were exposed from ages about 7 to 15 years, and they followed those children who are now adults. One of the things that has shown up is an increase in brain, prostate, and ovarian cancer, not just lung cancer. So asbestos is capable of causing tumors in other sites other than the pulmonary system. The next slide kind of shows you the toxicity factors that were developed by EPA, and these factors are toxicity factors that are used to help us calculate risk from exposure. As I said, they're not a regulatory number, they're a value that is to be used in risk assessment. We had a value that was generated in 1988 for asbestos, and that was 0.23 fibers per cc. And that value was for a mixture of chrysotile and amphibole asbestos. The value that we generated for Libby asbestos is 0.17 fibers per cc for the cancer value, and we developed a non-cancer value that is an estimate of the potency, if you will, for developing non-cancer diseases. And that number is 9e to the minus 5. Really small number. That equates to about 90 fibers per cubic meter, and the cubic meter is represented by that lady sitting inside of about the size of a wash machine. So, one other thing about the Libby amphibole asbestos, and that is that Libby amphibole asbestos is not a single mineral fiber. It is 6 mineral fibers. Those fibers include winchite, richterite, tremolite, which is one of the regulated 5 amphibole fibers, and then a couple of 3 minor constituents, a compound called magnesio-rupecite, magnesio-arfensinite, and edenite. And all of those fibers are asbestiform fibers that go into the Libby amphibole mix. And the Libby amphibole mix, as we know from the human population from animal studies, is quite toxic. The next slide shows you what a pleural plaque looks like. This is a white collagenous deposit on the thoracic wall. That's what a pleural plaque looks like, and it can not only show up on the thoracic wall, but can also show up on the diaphragm, and that's what this particular plaque is. And these plaques grow, they become calcified, they become rigid, and when they do that, the lung ceases to be able to easily expand and contract, and this can result in the loss of pulmonary function. So that's what a pleural plaque is, and that's what EPA chose to be the endpoint for developing the RFC, the reference concentration. The next slide. Just to reiterate the basis for our decision to use the Marysville cohort to develop the toxicity factors. The plant used Libby number 3 ore from 1959 to 1980. As I said, it contains the amphibole mixture that's listed there. The exposure to the individuals was fairly low. We had actual human industrial hygiene data from 1972, and the University of Cincinnati went back to the plant and looked at all the engineering controls and all the changes in air handling and those kinds of engineering changes in the plant, and were able to take the data that we had from the industrial hygiene and back calculate what the exposures might have been from 1959 until 1972. So we had a really solid job exposure matrix to allow us to estimate the dose-response relationship between exposure and development of localized pleural thickening. The facility had medical monitoring. We've been able to follow this cohort longitudinally since 1980 to currently 2015, which is a long time. That's a very unique population, actually, to study and to look at the development of non-cancer diseases in the population. And we also had good clinical data on these people. So this was the basis for determining the toxicity of Libby amphibole. The next slide. I think I'll just skip over this slide and go to the next slide, which is kind of a summary that, we've conducted an extensive review and analysis of cancer and non-cancer literature. We've looked at a number of human cohorts and chosen the Libby Minor cohort and the Marysville, Ohio cohort to model the exposure response and develop a toxicity value for cancer and mesothelioma, and for non-cancer, which we call the reference concentration. The cancer value is, as I said, is 0.17 fibers per cc. The RFC is 9 e to the minus 5, and these values actually were used in the Libby risk assessment. And with that, I will sit down.